Trillions of dollars are quietly walking out the door in China. And the gunpowder burning between Israel and Iran is pouring gasoline on a fire that was already well underway. This is the Margin Call Stories channel. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on the single biggest industrial shift of our lifetime. The great manufacturing exodus. Here's what most people miss. China doesn't just import Iranian oil. It depends on it like a hospital patient depends on an IV drip. In just the first 6 months of 2025, China was pulling in an average of 1.38 million barrels of Iranian crude every single day, nearly 90% of Iran's entire seaborne oil output. That's not a trade relationship, that's a lifeline. And right now, that lifeline is fraying at the seams. But here's where the story gets uncomfortably large. Because at the very same moment China's energy supply is wobbling, the factories, the orders, and the investment capital that built this industrial empire are all silently finding the exit. The engine is losing power. Make no mistake, China is still a colossus in global manufacturing. Nobody serious is arguing otherwise. But the machine that once churned out jaw-dropping export surpluses and attracted tidal waves of foreign investment, that machine is running hot, burning oil, and coughing smoke. You don't need a single catastrophic explosion to bring down an economy. The worst damage usually happens in slow motion, like rust eating through steel. Watch the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index. Think of it as a factory's pulse reading. Above 50 means growth, below 50 means contraction. In October 2025, China's official manufacturing PMI clocked in at 49.0, the 7th consecutive month of decline. Even the more dynamic private sector Caixin PMI was sitting just under 49, below the alarm line. Now consider GDP. China posted 5.0% growth in 2024. For a European economy, that's a champagne-popping moment. But China isn't a European economy. It's a system engineered to run on double-digit growth. Running at 5% is like strapping an F1 race car to a school zone speed limit. The last time China cleared 10% GDP growth was back in 2010. The IMF projects that by 2026, that number slides further to around 4.5% and keeps falling if structural reform stalls. The money tells the same story. In 2021, net foreign direct investment flowing into China topped $344 billion. By 2024, that figure had cratered to just $18.6 billion, a collapse of over 90%, the lowest reading in decades. That's not a market correction. That's a boardroom-level verdict, being rendered in real time in balance sheets across the globe. And beneath the slowdown lurks an even nastier disease: deflation. China's producer price index has been negative for over 3 straight years, dipping as deep as minus 2.3% in early 2025. Factories keep producing, but nobody's buying more. Inventories pile up, orders dry up. The only survival move left is to slash prices, undercutting competitors, running assembly lines at full throttle while profits evaporate completely. The Chinese have a word for this spiral: neizhuan, or involution. Picture a crowded movie theater. The person in the front row stands up for a better view, so the row behind them stands. Then the row behind that. Eventually, everyone in the building is on their feet with aching legs, and nobody can see the screen any better than before. That's the trap. Maximum effort, minimum reward. And it's eating China's industrial sector alive. Why companies are actually leaving. No CEO wakes up on a Tuesday morning and decides to dismantle a world-class supply chain out of personal grievance. Boardrooms don't work on emotions. They work on risk-adjusted returns. The old formula, China equals cheap plus reliable plus efficient, has cracked wide open. And here's exactly why. The demographic wall. China's working-age population now sits at roughly 68 to 69% of the total, and the median age is creeping toward 40. The vast army of young, low-cost workers who once packed the assembly lines from Shenzhen to Shanghai. That army is shrinking fast. Demographic projections show the 20 to 24 age bracket will fall off a cliff over the next decade. Scarce workers mean rising wages. Factory labor in China now runs close to $4 an hour, or higher, depending on region. Compare that to Vietnam or neighboring Southeast Asian markets, and suddenly, China's labor cost edge has largely disappeared. The tariff wall. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods are now at their highest levels since the 1930s. The calculus for any executive sitting at a spreadsheet is no longer, is China efficient? It's now, am I betting my entire supply chain on a country where Washington and Beijing could lock horns tomorrow morning and my containers get stuck mid-ocean? That's not operational risk. That's existential risk. The legal wall, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, is no longer a political talking point. It's a compliance nightmare. In 2025 alone, the UFLPA entity list exploded from 20 names to 144. U.S. Customs conducted over 16,000 shipment inspections, flagging nearly $3.7 billion in goods. For any American brand still tangled in Chinese supply chains, the exposure is brutal. Reputational risk from human rights allegations, customs detention risk that freezes your capital, and ESG reporting pressure that now requires tracking every ton of carbon, every material origin, every human rights touchpoint across the entire chain. The cost compounding wall. A giant corporation can absorb slightly higher wages. It can stomach a few quarters of elevated taxes. It can even hire a legal army to handle the compliance paperwork. But when every single one of those risk bills arrives simultaneously from one country, the board of directors starts asking the one question every executive dreads. Why do we still have the majority of our manufacturing assets in one place? Add the Iran crisis choking energy flows and spiking logistics costs across Asian shipping lanes, and the math tilts even harder. The exodus isn't driven by a single breaking point. It's driven by 1,000 smaller ones all crashing into the same wall at once. The new manufacturing map. Nobody in any serious boardroom is telling you to raise your entire China operation to the ground. The real strategic playbook is far more surgical. Don't build your next factory there. Redirect new capital, new capacity, and next-generation assembly lines to safer ground. That is the quiet mechanism of the Great Exodus. Mexico is the biggest nearshoring jackpot. It shares a land border with the U.S., sits inside a favorable trade agreement, and offers shipping windows of 1 to 7 days by truck, versus weeks bobbing across the Pacific in a shipping container. In just the first half of 2024, foreign direct investment into Mexico hit $31.1 billion. Yes, labor costs run $4.40 to $6.10 an hour. Not exactly bargain bin pricing. But when you factor in speed, tariff advantages, and geopolitical stability, the landed cost math often tilts in Mexico's favor. The congestion at border crossings and the maze of import regulations are real headaches, but manageable ones. India is swinging for the fences on scale and subsidy. New Delhi is deploying billions in incentive packages to attract global manufacturing giants. Apple is a flagship case study. Forecasts put roughly 25% of all iPhones sold globally being assembled in India by 2026. The domestic market, over 1 billion consumers with accelerating purchasing power, is an added magnet. Build it there and sell it there. The friction points are real. Infrastructure gaps and regulatory red tape still slow the process, but the trajectory is unmistakably upward. Vietnam is the quiet overachiever. By end of 2025, Vietnam is projected to produce 20% of the world's iPads and Apple Watches, 5% of all MacBooks, and a jaw-dropping 65% of all AirPods. Labor costs hovering around $3 an hour, combined with a fast-expanding electronics ecosystem now exceeding $100 billion in scale, make it one of the most attractive assembly destinations on Earth. Thailand is cashing in on automotive manufacturing migration. Indonesia is emerging as a strategic powerhouse, sitting on critical mineral reserves that feed the global EV battery supply chain. ASUS has shifted over 90% of its motherboard and PC production out of China, spreading across Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Toy giant MGA Entertainment has announced it's moving 40% of its production to these same new destinations. But understand the real complexity here. Final assembly plants are the easy part to relocate. The brutal challenge sits in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 supply chains. The steel mold shops, the specialized chemical processors, the microscopic but critical component makers. Economic research institutions broadly agree. Right now, diversification is mostly happening at the surface level. Deeper upstream, at raw materials and core components. The world is still fundamentally anchored to China's industrial base. That product in your living room tagged Made in Vietnam or Made in Mexico. Look deeper. Its DNA is still largely Chinese. The world cannot erase China's role overnight. But profit margins, next-generation factories, and billions in capital expenditure absolutely can find the exit door first. The domino effect inside China manufacturing in China isn't just an industry. It's the load-bearing concrete pillar of the entire domestic economy, feeding the banking system, inflating the real estate market, and paying the bills for hundreds of millions of families. When that pillar starts cracking, the cracks spread in every direction. China's 2025 foreign trade turnover was still an enormous 45.47 trillion yuan, approaching $6.5 trillion US dollars, a number large enough to buy out several mid-sized economies combined. But raw volume doesn't equal health. A factory can run at full capacity and still be hemorrhaging money if margins are crushed and buyers are walking away. When global demand weakens and orders thin out, the only way to keep assembly lines from going cold is fire sale pricing. Imagine a bakery with capacity to bake 10,000 loaves a day, but customers only buy 5,000. You don't shut off the ovens. You sell the remaining 5,000 for less than the cost of flour just to generate cash flow for payroll. The bakery looks busy. Goods are constantly moving, but internally, it's bleeding to death. At a national scale, crushed factory profits trigger a cascade. Hiring freezes, wage cuts, bonus eliminations, halted machinery purchases. That is the dark underbelly of the involution syndrome. And when workers see their income erode, China's most dangerous economic bomb starts ticking: the real estate market. Bloomberg Economics estimates the housing crisis has already vaporized approximately $18 trillion in household wealth. The housing sector's share of GDP has shrunk from 24% down to 19%. For the average Chinese family, their home isn't just property. It's their retirement plan, their kids' marriage fund, their entire financial identity. When that anchor asset free falls, the response is universal. Tighten belts, cancel spending, hoard cash. Meanwhile, local governments, historically dependent on land sales to fund everything from industrial parks to infrastructure, suddenly find their revenue pipelines bone dry. The IMF estimates total expanded local government debt, including off-book financing vehicles, has swelled to 124% of GDP. Governments drowning in debt cannot roll out meaningful stimulus, cannot save jobs, cannot patch the gaping holes in social safety nets left by shuttered factories. The youth unemployment rate hit 17.3% in October 2025. The urban average sits at 5.2%, which sounds manageable until you realize an entire generation of college graduates is being locked out of the economy. When tomorrow's paycheck is uncertain, when real estate is cratering, when bonuses have vanished, consumers don't spend. They hunker down. Chinese household consumption is limping along at roughly 40% of GDP, anemic compared to nearly 68% in the United States. Beijing is urging citizens to open their wallets, but the public is in full squirrel before winter mode, stockpiling acorns, not spending them. The high-stakes transition gamble. Beijing isn't blind to any of this. They know the old machine is out of breath, and they are performing open-heart surgery on it during a marathon. The 15th five-year plan, running 2026 to 2030, is a sweeping technological self-reliance blueprint. China is going all in on an AI plus strategy, targeting AI integration across every corner of the economy, with a goal of 90% AI adoption in end-user devices by 2030. This is the aggressive successor to Made in China 2025. With one ironclad domestic target, produce 70% of core components and materials in-house without depending on Western supply chains. But transforming a billion-person industrial economy is nothing like updating software. The old model ran on massive scale, military-grade discipline, and brutally cheap labor costs. The new model demands something categorically different: brilliant engineers, breakthrough IP, cutting-edge semiconductors, and software talent at scale. You can't hand a worker who spent 2 decades assembling plastic toy shells a laptop on Monday and expect him to write autonomous vehicle algorithms by Friday. That gap creates wage polarization, the classic hallmark of the middle-income trap. White-collar workers in AI, semiconductors, and biotech will prosper, but hundreds of millions of blue-collar workers will be displaced by automation, pushed into low-productivity service work, food delivery, ride-hailing, with no clear economic ladder in front of them. The system is simultaneously too expensive to compete purely on price, and not yet broad enough for everyone to ride the technology wave. And when China does succeed in high-tech sectors, the West slams the door. Chinese EVs dominated global exports, nearly 5 million vehicles shipped in 2023, surpassing Japan. The response? The US slapped a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. Europe followed with anti-subsidy tariffs approaching 40%. Every time China steps off the elevator into the penthouse of global trade, a tariff door swings directly into its face. Trade War 2.0 is underway, fiercer and far less predictable than the first round. The takeaway: don't misread this story. The China Plus One shift is not a death certificate for Chinese manufacturing. China still commands roughly 1/3 of all global manufacturing output, and has held the #1 position for over 15 consecutive years. The world we're entering is not a world without China. It's a fractured world split down the middle. One ecosystem orbiting Western markets, another orbiting Beijing's industrial axis. But if you walk away from this with just 3 things: 1. In today's world, global capital doesn't chase the cheapest wages. It chases the lowest risk. That equation has permanently changed. 2. Supply chains don't vanish overnight. Assembly moves first. Then chemicals, components, and raw materials follow. Slowly, over years. This is erosion, not explosion. Water wearing down stone, not a Hollywood detonation. 3. The China machine is still far too massive to simply set aside, but it is no longer as cheap, as predictable, or as indispensable as it was 15 years ago. And that is precisely why trillions of dollars are quietly changing course, dragging the fate of an entire economic era right along with them. Thanks for staying with Margin Call Stories all the way to the end. If this gave you a clearer lens on how the global economy actually works, hit like, share it with someone who thinks about the big picture, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive story. See you next time.